What has been causing fatalities over time, and what should be our response? The world is evolving, and with it, the diseases responsible for our demise. For instance, as of 2019, the most recent year with globally comparable dataset, the two leading global causes of death were cardiovascular diseases and cancers. Between 1990 and 2019, the proportion of people succumbing to these two diseases increased from 27.72% to 34.13%, and from 13.22% to 18.53%, respectively. In 1990, the third leading global cause of death was lower respiratory infections, accounting for 7.63% of all deaths. By 2019, this figure had declined to 4.58%, and its rank had dropped to 5. When we examine the absolute increase in deaths by disease, with 1990 set as the base year, we find that deaths from Alzheimer's disease and other dementias increased by 2.89 times, and those from HIV/AIDS by 2.56 times. Cardiovascular diseases and cancers have remained at the top in terms of the disease burden. These changes result from shifts in demographic structures, notably an aging population, evolving lifestyles, and the emergence of new infectious diseases. Regardless of the cause, one fact remains clear: we need to do more to prevent and treat these diseases to enhance our longevity. Given the pivotal role of human health in driving growth and development, understanding the leading causes of death and their burden is crucial for public health planning and interventions, including disease prevention and resource allocation. It aids in raising awareness of these health issues among the public, evaluating the effectiveness of various public health policy interventions, identifying emerging health threats and risks, comparing disease burdens, benchmarking and sharing knowledge across countries, tracking the progress of global health initiatives such as the MDGs and the SDGs, and informing healthcare policy development, among other critical purposes. This study employs two approaches to analyze the global fatal diseases: the share and growth of people killed by various diseases by country, and the share and growth of disease-adjusted life years, commonly known as DALYs. DALYs measure the global burden of disease by combining years of life lost due to premature mortality and years of health life lost due to disability, that is, YLLs and YLDs. Both datasets were obtained from our World in Data, although the same datasets can be accessed from the World Health Organization. The first dataset contained information on deaths by causes for 228 countries and regions and 31 unique diseases. The second dataset covered 228 countries, but only 25 diseases. In total, there were 45 unique diseases. 11 of them were common in both datasets. 20 diseases were in data 1 but not in data 2, and 14 diseases were in data 2 but not in data 1. These two datasets were used to calculate the shares of deaths and disease burdens, along with the absolute growth, with 1990 set as the base year. For example, if an infection killed 100 people in 1990 and 300 of them in 2019, then the growth is 300%. This growth will be the same for another disease, which, for instance, killed 100,000 people in the base year and 300,000 of them in the current selected year, in this case, 2019. Kindly take note of this distinction, as I will be revisiting it soon. Welcome, I'm James, an economist and a data scientist from Amelia Insights. I will explain the project structure as I discuss the key findings. Let's dive in. At the top right of the page, we have three elements: a select input where we can choose any country, a more filters button enabling customized sorting, and a presentation section. I will discuss this shortly. This table displays the rankings of that one diseases for which data on shares of deaths was available between 1990 and 2019. I used a slope chart diagram to connect the rankings between the 2 years. The diseases are ordered based on their shares of deaths in 1990. Green lines indicate a decline, while red ones show the opposite. The text colors follow the same scheme. The table also exhibits the shares of deaths caused by each disease, along with variations in ranks and shares between the 2 years. Different line weights are used, with the borderlines representing larger differences. We observe that cardiovascular diseases were the major causes of deaths in both 1990 and 2019 in the world. Although the rank remained the same, the shares of demises rose from 27.72 to 34.13%, a change of 6.41 percentage points. Alzheimer's disease and other dementias recorded the most significant global rank change, rising from the 17th to the 7th position. This indicates a worsening of 10 ranks. However, the share of deaths increased marginally by only 1.69 percentage points from 1.29 to 2.98%. Diseases related to nutritional deficiencies and protein energy malnutrition witnessed the largest declines, both dropping by 7 ranks. Please note that hovering over a disease changes the cursor to a pointer and the entire row for that disease turns blue. Clicking on a disease on the left side like cardiovascular displays a table showing the top and bottom 5 countries with largest and smallest changes in diseases ranks. For instance, cardiovascular diseases moved from the 7th position in 1990 to first in 2019 in Eritrea and Angola. However, in Scotland, England, France, Peru, and Eswatini, it declined from the first to the second position. Similarly, if we tap on the same disease on the right side, a table for the top and bottom 5 countries with largest and smallest changes in the disease share of deaths pops up. We observe that Bangladesh, East Timor, and Philippines have had the most significant jumps in the shares of deaths from the ailment, but Denmark, Israel, and Norway have had the highest drops. When choosing the second top killer disease in 2019, that is, neoplasms or cancers, Kenya was surprising as it topped the list in terms of rank change. In 1990, the disease ranked 11th in the country, rising to the third position in 2019. The reasons behind this trend and possible solutions will be discussed in the presentation section later on. Clicking on neoplasms or cancers on the right side reveals that South Korea, Monaco, and Taiwan documented the largest rises, while Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Angola had the biggest falls. Let me select a few countries to highlight specific observations. Picking the deaths due to conflict and terrorism on the left side shows that Yemen, Syria, and Libya had the largest increases in ranks, while Eritrea, Liberia, and Kuwait had the smallest. Pressing the disease on the right side reveals the changes in percentage points. Afghanistan, Yemen, and Syria topped the list, whereas Kuwait, Eritrea, and Liberia ranked at the bottom. Picking Yemen from the drop-down, we observe that deaths from conflict and terrorism rose by 8.3 percentage points. If we choose HIV/AIDS, we find that Djibouti and Lesotho have had the highest rates. Selecting these two countries from the drop-down, we see a staggering increase in Lesotho. In 1990, deaths from HIV/AIDS accounted for only 2.97% of all deaths. By 2019, this figure had risen dramatically to 33.75%, accounting for slightly higher than a third of all the deaths. Now I will choose another disease for illustration. Let me select the third largest killer disease in 2019, chronic respiratory diseases. Activating the link, we can observe that the share of deaths from this disease in Nepal increased by 11.86 percentage points. I will search for Nepal in the select input, allowing you to see more detailed information about the disease graphically. We can observe that it has jumped from 5th killer to the second in the reference period. I will now pause the explanations for about a minute and select a few representative countries from the drop-down. Then we will proceed to the next step. Brazil, China, India, Kenya, Mexico, Middle East and North Africa, OECD countries, United Arab Emirates, United States, I will now select World and click More Filters. A model appears at the center top of the page. It contains 3 select inputs and 3 buttons. The country select input is populated with the name of the country selected on the home page, but you can change it to any other country or region. Given that there are 3 select inputs, there are 7 possible combinations in which a user can select these to explore the underlying data and gain useful insights. All these options are as described below. We will begin with the selection of all the 3 and end with 1. The first combination of all the inputs yields the summary statistics for that disease in a given year and country. I will select 2019 wound and cardiovascular diseases. We have 45 elements in the disease input. The options with a white background are for those diseases for which we have death data but not the burden of disease. The light gray background is for those ones for which we have data for the burden of disease but not deaths. The light orange colored options indicate the ones for which we have both datasets. For example, we have data for both deaths and burden of disease for the cardiovascular diseases. I will click Apply Filters to get the statistics. Observe that when we click this button, we remove the select input and instead append a home button. This is because this input is not needed here. We see that in 2019, cardiovascular diseases constituted 34.13% of all the deaths in the world, and the burden of disease was 15.9%. The growth of the two, with 1990 set as the base year, that is 100, was 153.81 and 140.48 respectively. This implies that the deaths and the burden of the disease for this malady had increased by almost 1.5 times by 2019. Before we choose other 3 sets of values for illustration, observe that when I click the home button, we are taken back to the home page. Let's now again tap more filters and select neoplasms, also known as cancers, the second killer disease in the world as at 2019. We see that the respective values as described previously are 18.85, 10.17, 175.13, and 152.61 respectively. I will now select 2019, South Africa, and HIV/AIDS. Note that as explained previously, there was no data for the burden of disease for this sickness. Thus, when we submit, we see that the share of deaths from this malaise was 28.46%, and the disease had grown by a multiple of 50.46 between 1990 and 2019. Finally, let's go back to the homepage and select any country or region, search for Alzheimer's disease on the 4th column, and click it. We can see that Japan had the highest change in the share of Alzheimer's in the study period, that is, of 8.52 percentage points. We will click more filters, select 2019, Japan, and Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. We can observe that the share of casualties from this element was 12.04%, and it had grown by almost 5.8 times between 1990 and 2019. The second option a user can explore this data is by selecting year and country only. I will select 2019 and high-income countries and apply the filters. We can clearly observe that the majority of the deaths were caused by cardiovascular diseases and cancers. Drug use disorders and diarrhea diseases have grown the most. Neoplasms and cardiovascular diseases cause the highest burden of diseases in these countries, and substance use disorders and diabetes and kidney diseases have had the largest values in terms of growth of burden of maladies. When we select a high-income country, say the United Kingdom, we can observe that these traits are almost similar. If we switch to low-income countries and select 2019, we observe that cardiovascular and neonatal disorders were the major leading causes of deaths. The final entity I will use to illustrate this is Latin America and the Caribbean. Here, we also observe that cardiovascular diseases and neoplasms are the major causes of death and disease burden. I will now select cardiovascular diseases in lower middle income countries. We can clearly observe that the deaths from this sickness have been on a steady rise, and so has its share of burden of diseases. Let's switch to upper middle income countries and choose neoplasms or cancers. We can see that the share of deaths and burden of neoplasms are rising faster than their respective growths. I will select Middle East and North Africa and examine the deaths and the burden of the disease from conflict and terrorism. We note that although the shares of deaths and the burden of disease are not as high as the other diseases, the growth of the two is in contrast to what we have just seen for upper middle income countries for neoplasms. I will then pick year 2019 and neoplasms. Here, we render a packed bubble chart with the top 10 countries with the largest shares of deaths and the burden of disease for the selected sickness and year. The reject labels are also sorted by average values for the selected disease in the 4 income categories. For instance, here, we can notice that in 2019, on average, neoplasms or cancers were responsible for 27.39% of all the deaths in high-income countries, but only 7.89% in low-income ones. The growth of the burden of the ailment had grown by 2.32 times in lower middle income countries, but by 1.89 in high income group. Note that although there are fewer deaths from this malady in lower income countries, that is, of 11.95%, the growth of the burden of the illness is highest in these countries. For the bubble charts, I have added a zoom functionality so that we can see the details better. We can discern that it is mostly the high-income countries that have topped in neoplasms deaths. Monaco, Andorra, and San Marino had the largest values of 43.86, 39.39, and 39.18% respectively. When we zoom in the growth of the deaths, we see that the top 3 countries which have registered the highest increase in deaths are United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Djibouti, with the multiples of 8.46, 6.15, and 4.18 respectively. Note that consistent with what we saw previously, that Kenya is the top worldwide in terms of rank changes as far as cancers are concerned, the country is among the leading here. As explained previously, the options with right orange backgrounds indicate that there is data for both deaths and the burden of the disease. In such scenarios, I have rendered bubble charts for both deaths and the burden of diseases. When we click next, we thus see information for the burden of illness for neoplasms in terms of the share and growth. We can perceive that high-income countries account for the largest share of the burden of diseases from neoplasms, and low-income ones trade in the least. The lower middle-income countries are experiencing the largest growth in the burden of this disease, and surprisingly, the high-income countries, which have the largest shares of their deaths attributed to neoplasms among the 4 categories, have the lowest growth of the burden. When we zoom in, we can see the top 10 countries which have had the largest increase in the burden of disease in each case. Let's now select HIV/AIDS and year 2019. We see that there are a few countries that have borne the largest brunt of the illness. Also, note that it is the low-income countries which have had the largest share of deaths and growth from this ailment. When we pick cardiovascular disease in 2019 and then zoom in, we note that there are several countries where the disease accounts for over 50% of all the deaths, with Ukraine, Bulgaria, and Belarus having the shares larger than 60%. We can also note that United Arab Emirates has had the largest rise in deaths from the disease. Additionally, it is also clear that it is the upper middle income countries which have had the largest proportion of deaths from this malady, but its burden is rising fastest in lower middle income countries. Let me select a few more sicknesses, all of them for year 2019, Alzheimer's and other dementias. Chronic kidney diseases. Neonatal diseases. Drug use disorders. Let's now move on to SIGO selections. We will begin with year. Let's first pick 2019. When we do so, we get 4 bar graphs showing the shares of deaths and burden of disease and their growth in the world in the selected year. We note that cardiovascular, neoplasms, and chronic respiratory maladies were responsible for most of the deaths in the world in 2019. Alzheimer's, HIV/AIDS, and Parkinson's are growing at the fastest rates. Cardiovascular, neoplasms, and neonatal disorders contribute the most to the burden of maladies. The 3 elements with the largest growth in the burden of disease relative to 1990 are diabetes and kidney diseases, HIV and sexually transmitted infections, and musculoskeletal diseases. I will now choose 5 years interval starting from 1990, and we observe the trends. Note that since 1990 is the base year, the growth of the deaths and burden of ailments are normalized to 100 or 1. 1990. 1995. 2000. 2005. Here, note that the absolute HIV/AIDS deaths had increased by a multiple of 5.45 since 1990 in the world. 2010. 2015. Let's move on to a case where we select a country only. This option allows the user to visualize the top 5 killer diseases in the selected country in 2019, but now tracked over time, that is, between 1990 and 2019, in order to understand their evolution. I will first make a selection of our homeland, world. We can clearly observe that cardiovascular and neoplasms contribute to the largest share of deaths, and their values have been rising over time. The growth of deaths from HIV/AIDS and its burden has been declining, but that of these 4 other diseases have been rising. On the contrary, the share of burden of ailments from the 2 killer diseases, neoplasms and cardiovascular, has been increasing, but that of respiratory infections and tuberculosis and neonatal disorders has been falling. Nevertheless, their growth in absolute values have been rising. When we select a big country like India, we see increasing cases of cardiovascular and neoplasms, but falling shares of diarrhea. The growth of the absolute deaths from HIV/AIDS has been declining, having increased by a multiple of more than 140 or 14,000% by 2005. The shares of burden of disease from cardiovascular, chronic respiratory sickness, and neoplasms are on the rise. That of neonatal diseases and respiratory infections and tuberculosis are reducing. When we consider the absolute numbers, deaths from diabetes and kidney diseases and musculoskeletal disorders are skyrocketing at the fastest rate. Let's move to China and see what has been happening there. Cardiovascular and cancers form the largest shares of deaths and burden of sickness, and they are on the upswing. The absolute deaths from HIV/AIDS and Alzheimer's disease and other dementias are growing at the fastest rate, but when we consider the growth of burden of diseases, HIV/AIDS and diabetes and kidney infections take the lead. Switching to Germany, we see that cardiovascular and cancers are responsible for the majority of the deaths. In absolute terms, deaths from diarrhea are rising at the fastest rate. Note that this does not imply that the malady is killing many people, but rather, it means that the number of deaths resulting from this disease is increasing at a higher rate. For instance, in 1990, the sickness only killed 557 people in the country, but this number rose to 4297 in 2019, and therefore the normalized growth is 4297 divided 557 times 100, which equals 771.45%, or 7.71 times. The disease burden from cardiovascular is weakening, with the highest reduction occurring between 1990 and mid-2000s. I will choose 5 other representative countries and then we proceed to the last possible selection option, Argentina. European region. Lower middle income countries. United States. South Africa. Let's now move on to selecting disease only. When I do so, a chart for top 5 countries that have had the largest shares of the ailment in 2019 shows on the page, and the evolution of the disease in the country is examined over time. For instance, I will pick cardiovascular. Ukraine, Bulgaria, and Belarus have had the largest shares of both deaths and burden from this infection. UAE, Philippines, and East Timor have had the largest growth of deaths. The same countries also have the biggest growth of burden of diseases. When we choose cirrhosis and other liver diseases, we observe that Egypt, Cambodia, and Turkmenistan have had the largest shares of deaths. If we select diabetes mellitus, we can get that Fiji, Mauritius, and Bahrain have the largest shares of deaths, but Guatemala, Uzbekistan, and Bahrain are experiencing the biggest growth in the disease. If we choose cancers, we find that they kill majority of people in Monaco, San Marino, and Andorra, but the growth of the disease is most prevalent in UAE, Qatar, and Djibouti. The proportion of deaths from malaria is declining fast, but you can discern that the infection still accounts for over 14% of all the deaths in these African countries. We may be interested to find out where road injuries kill most people. Surprisingly, majority of the countries are in the Arabian region or Middle East. Perhaps there is a common behavior in this region that accounts for this trend. The largest share of people killed by substance use and disorders is in USA, followed by Estonia and Scotland. In terms of the growth of the deaths from this ailment, UAE, Qatar, and Mongolia top the list. I will now select other 5 sicknesses, and then we will move on to the last section of this project, which is presentation. Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. Conflict and terrorism. Neonatal disorders. Parkinson's disease. Tuberculosis. Let's move to presentation now. Policy recommendations for addressing global leading causes of death and their disease burden. Number 1, invest in research and development to create new and better treatments, vaccines, and advanced technologies like telemedicine. This will ensure a decline in the share of deaths from diseases with high mortality rates, such as HIV/AIDS, Alzheimer's and other dementias, cardiovascular, and cancers. Global collaboration to address common pandemics and gain insights into their underlying causes should be encouraged, given the commonality of these diseases and the international interconnectedness through trade, transport, and other forms of globalization. Simultaneously, it is imperative to draw lessons from the best performing countries, that is, those where the proportions of deaths from a specific disease are decreasing compared to the ones where the same disease share are rising. The improvement of healthcare infrastructure and equipment will play a pivotal role in alleviating the burden of chronic diseases. Number 2, promote healthy lifestyles and proper screening services. Addressing the root causes of high death rates resulting from unhealthy lifestyles is crucial, alongside proper screening services. This encompasses improper diets such as high intake of processed foods, foods laden with toxins and chemicals, tobacco use, alcohol consumption, and exposure to environmental pollutants and carcinogens, especially in the air and water, among others. The public should be educated on healthy lifestyles and disease prevention mechanisms, including strategies to fostering good character and environmental responsibility. This can lead to healthier choices and behavior. Let me revisit the issue of improper diets once again. When you examine the data from the Food and Agricultural Association, or FAO, we find that the situation is grim. As at 2021, 42.2% of the global population could not afford healthy food. Let me scroll to the top and you will be shocked. As high as 90% of the people cannot afford healthy foods in many countries. The situation is also the same when we consider the prevalence of moderate or severe food insecurity. Between 2014 and 2022, the situation worsened by 30.3 percentage points in Western Sahara and by 8.4 percentage points in the world. This means that there is food crisis, yet few governments admit it and work towards it. If such a high proportion of people cannot afford healthy foods, how then do they meet their other basic needs like housing, education, and health? Thus, although many people may want a healthy lifestyle, it may be far too expensive for them. Therefore, we need to be careful in recommending healthy lifestyles and proper diets. There is a lot that needs to be done to lower the cost of living, which will first ensure that all individuals have access to basic needs, specifically healthy, nutritious, and affordable foods in this context. This can be done through policies that support agriculture, food production, and distribution. I will discuss this issue in details when I undertake a project on global food security in one of the 25 projects that I have committed to undertake. Number 3, make healthcare more accessible and affordable for everyone, including prevention, diagnosis, and treatment. Governments must hasten measures to ensure universal health coverage irrespective of people's income, health, or social status. This aligns with the United Nations Universal Healthcare 2030 Agenda, that is UHC, which emphasizes the importance of equitable healthcare, and it is achievable even in low-income countries. Rwanda is a good example of such a country. All that is needed is willingness, determination, and commitment. Number 4, fight poverty. Poverty is a major driver of poor health. It hinders access to healthy foods and increases exposure to environmental pollutants. Lowering the cost of living and the persistent income inequalities will be a big boost in addressing the underlying socioeconomic factors that contribute to unhealthy behaviors and choices. This can be accomplished through enhancing equal accessibility of quality education, food, housing, and social cohesion. Because money is essential for meeting our daily needs, people will do anything to earn it, even if it involves engaging in activities that result in long-term negative consequences. Many individuals, therefore, do not prioritize long-term well-being and sustainability, as their primary focus is to maximize their present earnings. For instance, this includes practices like cultivating agricultural crops with excessive fertilizers, insecticides, herbicides, and other chemicals to boost yields, as well as deforestation, which contributes to pollution, among other harmful actions. Consider this report released in September 2023 that showed that half of the pesticides used by farmers in Kenya are toxic. Is it then surprising that the country tops the world in rank increase concerning neoplasms or cancers? To work towards a scenario where the primary objective of individuals is to maximize long-term communal well-being for the benefit of all and not personal wealth, we need to prioritize caring for one another, ensure that all our actions encompass love and care, and enhance each other's well-being. In short, we must practice compassion, empathy, and mutual support. This will require a change in our values and in our economic system. We need to create a society where everyone has the opportunity to meet their basic needs without having to exploit themselves or others. We also need to value things other than money, such as community relationships and the environment. We need to work together to create a more just, equitable, and sustainable world. This is a challenging goal, but I believe it is possible, and we are committed to enhancing this. By doing so, we can reduce the occurrence of deaths resulting from lifestyle diseases, road injuries, and other related causes. Number 5, foster peace. Peace is essential to prevent deaths from conflict and terrorism. Promoting conflict resolution and peace-building efforts should be a global priority. The idea of caring for one another can lead to a greater empathy and cooperation, reducing the likelihood of violence and conflict. Number 6, address climate change. Climate change is a multifaceted issue that can impact health through extreme weather that leads to food shortages as a result of crop failures following heat waves, droughts, and floods. Mitigating climate change and endorsing sustainable practices in agriculture are essential steps. This can help ensure food security and reduce environmental health risks. The ongoing global efforts to combat climate change are welcome and thus should be supported by every country. Number 7, continually monitor disease threats. The government and other stakeholders should keep a close surveillance on disease threats to ensure timely healthcare policies, interventions, and responses. In conclusion, our health is indeed our greatest wealth, and the data reveals a stark reality. The share of deaths and disability-adjusted life years attributed to some of the world's top killer diseases has seen an alarming rise over the past few decades. This emphasizes the urgency for increased investment and action. The seeds of progress have been sown, but there is still much ground to cover. As we endeavor to reshape the world's health narrative, let us not forget that the truest measure of our success is our ability to enhance the well-being of the other. Let's remain committed to a future where the burdens of the disease grow lighter, where health knows no borders, and where our shared humanity propels us towards greater perfection. Together, we can create a world where everyone has the opportunity to live a long, healthy, and fulfilling life. In our next discussion, we will explore and gain fresh insights into the cost of living across the world. Until then, goodbye for now.